Have you ever felt there was an invitation on your life to trust and believe? Hey there, I am Danielle Zapchenk, and I am so thankful you are joining me today on the Parable Podcast. I am thrilled for you to meet my guest, executive coach, Ruthie Kim. She shares about how there was this thread of God's heart weaving its way throughout her life.
We're doing things for Him. We're living in the world. We're serving. We're building. We're creating. Absolutely. That's all good stuff. But ultimately, He's committed to us and our transformation to become more like Jesus. And I'm so grateful for that, because I do have a tendency to want to do for Jesus. Like, let me do more stuff for you. And there are seasons where I felt the Lord just be like, actually, I don't want you to do anything. I just want you to be. I just want you to become. And I've had to wrestle with that.
Here's my conversation with Ruthie Kim. I am thrilled to introduce you to Ruthie Kim. Ruthie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Ruthie, you are an executive coach day to day. I would be interested to know, how did that trajectory start for you?
Wow, that's a big question as we kick right off here, Danielle. So I have to go back a little bit to answer that. Mm-hmm. So born and raised in the UK, moved to San Francisco, which is where I currently reside 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I came out here to do ministry in the inner city, and I did that for more than 20 years. Mm-hmm. And I can definitely get into that throughout our conversation today. But in the context of doing that, I was really plugged into my local church. I was doing a lot of leadership development, and I had a friend that came to me, and she had a small business, and she was like, hey, I'd love to hire you to be my coach. And I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, I don't know what a coach is. I'm not looking for another job. And it really triggered this journey for me. This was about, I'd say about 8 to 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. Triggered this journey for me where she was so persistent that she felt that I could help her on her journey, that it got me really curious and intrigued. And I got connected to another executive coach. I ended up hiring him and working with him. And it was so transformational in my life that I thought, this is great. Like, if this is changing me so much and I could help other people, then let's go. And so I did a kind of a small business on the side of ministry for quite a few years with a number of women. And that's how I first got into it. But it really was kind of a side thing that I picked up and put down depending on my season and how old my kids were. And then when I transitioned out of ministry, out of full-time ministry, and was really exploring what was next for my life, again, I had re-engaged with that same executive coach. He joined a firm. They were doing really incredible work with individuals and groups and companies. And I just lit up. Every time I listened to their podcast, every time I heard their stories, I thought, this is the kind of transformational work that I've always been about. Yes, at different contexts. But if I could do that, would be thrilling. And so that was about 3 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago. And I took a plunge, which again is going to be a theme in our conversation, I think, today. But took a leap and said, okay, let's give this a whirl. And I've been doing that full-time ever since.
I think the part that stood out for me is when you said you picked up and you put it down, and also just noticing when you lit up. I think so many times we think, okay, if we are on this certain route, this is the only path that we can take, and just kind of navigating, like, how do you find your passion? How do you figure what is working for this season and what is not working for that? Yeah, I get that. Ruthie, going back a little bit to when you were a child, was there anything that was like bizarre that you believed like wholeheartedly? Like, this is, I'll give you mine first. So yeah, I for sure thought that if I was in a deep end of a pool by myself, that there would be somehow a shark that would come out of the drain and get me. We had a pool in our backyard, and if I was ever in there, I thought I have to get to the ladder in time because the shark is going to come. Now, as an adult, I do know that sharks cannot live in chlorinated water, but that I believed wholeheartedly that was true. So I would just be interested to know, do you have anything like that? Or
that is so funny. You know, I nothing quite like that springs to mind, but somebody actually asked me a question recently about something that you believed as a child and you were convinced of at the time. And I have this memory now, you know, memory in air quotes, like memory of flying. I believe that I could fly as a child, like literally in my living room. could lift up and like wild and crazy. Why I believed that at the time, why I have an actual memory of it, bizarre, but that's, I guess, the imagination of a child.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I wish I could fly too. That would be so fun. If you could travel either back in time or travel towards the future, which one would you choose and why?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I'm going to be honest. I think I'd probably say the future. I mean, I love my life and the past and reading about the past and history and all of that, but that's already been lived. I would actually, and this probably says a lot about my personality, I'd love a glimpse of the future. Yes. I'd love a glimpse of where my life's going, where the world is going. Like, I think that would be fascinating, especially if I could go forward and then come back and then tell everyone like, hey, let's go. This is what we can go after. Like, that'd be amazing. You and your husband, you have 2 boys, is that right?
Right. What would you say is the most challenging thing about being a parent of 2 boys and the most joyous?
So I have 2 boys, 10 and 15. So I have a high schooler and then I have a 5th grader. Oof, challenging. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on that. But I think for my family, my 2 boys are polar opposites.
Okay.
And so I think my eldest is very much like me. And so when I was raising him, it was almost intuitive to know what he needed, how to interact with him. And then there's about 4.5 years between my boys. So I was like, this is just how parenting is. And look at me. Aren't I great at it? Because it comes so natural. It's some things, not everything, but some things. And then my youngest came into the world and he, in many ways, is very much like my husband. He's a deep feeler, highly creative, very gifted, outside of the box, does things his way. And suddenly I was struck with this sense of like, oh, this is a different style of parenting. And so the challenge of knowing what both boys need, like either boy needs in each moment, learning to adjust and to pivot and to know it's not my way or the highway. It's really meeting them where they're at and knowing what a good parent looks like for either of them, even with the schools that they go to or the interests that they have. So I'd say that's been one of the biggest challenges. The joy is, oh my gosh, I love this season I'm in with my kids. You know, the little season, the season when they're little and cute and all of that has its own set of challenges. Yeah. But there is something about this season where they are developing their personalities, they're developing a level of agency. There's a real friendship that I think is emerging, especially with my high schooler. There's joking that we get to do. It's just, it's special. So again, getting to know them in their individuality and explore who they are and build something new with them. That's what I'm loving right now.
So what for you, Ruthie, when you look back on 2024, like you're like, I was really proud of this.
Again, strangely enough, someone asked me that question in a meeting earlier today. For me, what I'm looking back on is I'm so proud of myself and my family for how we've navigated change. We've had a lot of change, a lot of ups and downs. We've had health challenges. We've had career transitions. We've had, a kid moving to a new school for high school. We've had a lot going on. And what I'm so thrilled with is that we still love each other. We still like each other. We still love Jesus. We are still here, alive and well. And so, I think it's the connectedness, I think, that we've had in the midst of the ups and downs. I'm so proud of the way that my husband and I have stayed connected, imperfectly, of course, but still really connected in our marriage and with our children. And so, I think that's what I'm celebrating.
Well, Ruthie, this podcast is all about stories and how people are connected really through it, how God has taught us something, how we've learned lessons along the way. And so I'd love for you to share with us, what is one of your parable stories?
So I'm going to share today a little bit of a thread that's woven throughout my life. And I would say it's something that I've learned and something I continue to relearn almost every day, every week, every month. It really, where it starts for me is when I was in Paris when I was 16. So I grew up in the UK and we had this wonderful opportunity to take a school trip and we went to Paris. I have this very, very distinct memory of being on this tour, overlooking Paris at night. The Eiffel Tower was lit up and she was beautiful. She's shimmering. It's just like that scene out of a movie almost. Yeah. And I was 13. All my friends were just like messing around, taking photos. And I have a very distinct memory of feeling extremely emotional and starting to cry. And still to this day, I remember the feeling of confusion. I'd even say shame. Like, what on earth is going on? As I'm looking over this vast city and seeing this Eiffel Tower. And I did not know what was happening there. Only in hindsight was I able to identify, because I've experienced it since. And what was going on for me in that moment, Danielle, was I was experiencing God's heart for that city. And there was an overwhelming feeling. There was something moving inside of me. And that was really the beginning of a journey for me that has brought me through many different things to where I am now in San Francisco. Ultimately, 2 years later, I would move from England to San Francisco, just turned 18, had a whole plan for my life to go to college and do these other things, and then had this distinct call to go into ministry. And so there's this thread of this idea that when something starts small, it is so much more than what I think it's going to be. This idea that God is so deeply at work in my life, in our lives, that one small yes, hey, I'll go to San Francisco for 6 months, or one small movement of the Spirit as I overlooked Paris. These moments, these memories, these, I'd say, movements of the Spirit really in us. It's always so much more than we think it's going to be. And that's the thread for me. And the invitation in that, I think, right up into present life is to trust and believe that. Because it is so easy to just see what we see, feel what we feel, and think, this is it. This is my lot in life. This is what I've been given. This is all it's going to be. And to see how God continually expands, that's really the ongoing parable of my life. So I came to San Francisco when I was 18. I thought I was coming for a short stint. Like I said, I'm here 25 years later. I just kept staying. That small yes became a year and 2 years. And I think at about 5 or 6 years, I stopped asking God. I was like, okay, Lord, if you want to move me, you'll have to tell me because something's growing here. So I stayed, and I realized that I was becoming a new person. That was one of the most significant areas I can point to of, like, I didn't realize when I said that yes to God that I was going to change. I was going to transform so much. So there's that portion of my story, which is, I certainly can dive into. But then really what I ended up building here and creating here became so much more. I started a ministry called Because Justice Matters, and we serve women and girls in low-income communities. And it's really about building pathways to brighter futures for them. And I did that work for about 13 or 14 years. And again, it was a small yes to Jesus when I felt invited to minister to women on the streets by painting nails, handing out warm drinks, praying for them. And it snowballed into a whole ministry, which now serves hundreds of women and girls and their family every year and still continues on even after I left it. Again, this thread, this parable, this invitation to believe that small yes, that situation that you see it is so much more and is going to become so much more. And I think that's a huge thread in my life.
When you go back to being on that balcony, that area in Paris, you said you're like, what is this feeling? Like, many people could just say, oh, well, you were just kind of overwhelmed with the beauty and like all of the glamour of Paris. But what made you kind of drill down into, I know that this is God's moving in my heart? Did you said you figured that out later, or it was kind of a journey through the next couple of years?
One of the things I'll say is that I know myself. I'm generally not a person that's moved in that way. Right. So I'm not the person walking through life looking at beauty going, oh my gosh, oh. Like I'm pretty matter of fact and pretty direct. So when emotion rises up in me from seemingly nowhere, that always grabs my attention. But I remember one of the triggers for realizing for me was in my early 20s, again, high point in San Francisco, overlooking the city, praying for the city, and having the same feeling come up in me. Like it was a movement towards, like, there's something here, like something's happening here. I'm part of a bigger story. That's what it felt like. Like, oh my gosh, I just stumbled into something and I didn't know there was a something, but I found myself in it. And now I'm like strapped in and being like, I need to pay attention. And so I've had that throughout my life, whether it be like moments like that, overlooking a city, or in conversation with someone, or an opportunity or a sermon. Like I'll suddenly feel this like, I'm in the midst of something so much bigger than myself. Pay attention, Ruthie, because there's an invitation here.
I love that. Pay attention because there is an invitation. You shared about how we need to start small and it can grow into something bigger. Sometimes it's hard for us to be aware and also to feel like, if it is so much bigger, like, is this the right step? Is this the next one I should take? There's this questioning that we wrestle with, so we really never even take the first step. What would be your encouragement to somebody who's like, I'm not really sure how to navigate this?
I can share a story to respond to that, actually. A few years into leading the ministry with women and girls, we identified that we really needed a space, our own space. We were in a shared building with another ministry, and we were like, we need a space. We need something of our own. And we started kind of the journey of fundraising and all of that you do when you're a nonprofit. And I remember it was the beginning of the year. It was my first day back in January, and we had been praying around our neighborhood. We were focused on one neighborhood, praying around it, and an opportunity to rent a space came up. And so I went to go explore it. I met with the person that was leasing it, and the space was much larger than what we were looking for. It was kind of like 2 storefronts in a downtown area connected with a door. And I remember saying to her, like, oh, this is really more space than we need. We could just rent one side. And I remember the moment she said to me, yeah, you could do that, but we're really ideally looking for someone to rent too. And it was going to be a financial stretch. And I didn't know what we were going to use all the space for. And I remember I went home. And again, the way that the Lord meets you in the ordinary, I was home with my napping toddler and folding laundry on a table. And I just remember feeling the nudge of the Spirit, like a sudden awareness that I needed to take both sides of this building. There was purpose in it. And so I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to follow that lead. I'm going to see what happens. And so long story short, after we leased the space, we renovated the space, which was about a 9-month journey. Again, I was kind of in prayer with the Lord almost a year later on a bus heading downtown saying, God, we have this whole massive room. It's just going to sit empty. And immediately I saw an image of a young girl dancing ballet. She was a ballerina. And I felt like God said, I want you to open a dance studio for children. Now, at this time, our ministry was only to women. There was no plans to start a kids ministry, certainly nothing on our radar for a dance studio. We didn't have a dance teacher on our staff. There was, it just seemed like out of nowhere. And this is what I mean by the small yeses lead to so much more. Again, long story short, what emerged out of that is we built a dance studio. We launched a dance program. Right around the same time, we had a volunteer staff member that came to us and said, oh, by the way, I happen to be a dance teacher. And now our youth program, a decade later, is one of our most thriving ministries where we are working with young girls in low-income communities that are facing all kinds of obstacles and challenges. Some of the girls that were in that dance studio at the very first class are now in college. And we have been part of their story and are still part of their story. And so I say all that to say is sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we think, well, maybe should I? I always invite, when I'm coaching people, I always invite people to have a bent towards action. Like if you don't know, it's better to be moving than to be paralyzed, because when we're moving, we soon figure it out. So if you're moving in a direction and the door closes and it's like, not for now, great, I have clarity. Now I can back up and go in a different direction. But with paralysis, we just never know. So often many of us are waiting for like, well, I'll know, I'll get clear. Often the clarity comes in the movement. So if I was speaking to someone right now, I would say, get moving. Do something, head in a direction, test it, explore it, see what happens, and then you can make more decisions from that.
Ruthie, you had said that during this learning process that you were becoming a new person and that you didn't realize it was you that were going to change. What were some of those effects, either like internally within your soul, that changed about yourself? And right now, I guess you would say that I'm really proud of that change that has occurred.
Gosh, where to begin? There's been so much transformation. Again, a story. When I started Because Justice Matters, I had these inklings of a dream of doing something to help women. And growing up, I was always very shy. I've always been pretty direct and had a lot to say, but in public, in school especially, I was very shy, I was very timid, very insecure. And so when I had the beginnings of this vision for ministry, there was a lot of second guessing. There's a lot of insecurity. And I just didn't know if I had the capacity to emotionally hold what I was sensing needed to be created to serve women. Many of the women that we were serving were victims of violence. They were homeless. They had been in prostitution. Like, this was no small endeavor that I was sensing I was being invited into. And I had a dream one night, Danielle, and in the dream, I literally saw myself on a hospital bed, and Jesus was the surgeon, and he opened up where my heart is, and he took out this little heart, and then he had this big heart that he was putting into me. And in the dream, I remember I had this thought of like, oh my gosh, like, how can I sustain a heart that big? And literally, as I thought that in the dream, I saw Jesus duct tape this massive like battery. It was like one of those big Energizer batteries onto the heart. And then he put it in me and sewed me back up. And I woke up from that dream, and I remember thinking, I am being invited to love in ways that I don't know if I've ever loved before. I'm invited to be faithful in ways, to show up in spaces. That is going to require me to be a different kind of person. But you know what? God has promised to sustain me in it. And that is something that I hold on to this day, that when we move towards transformation, when we move towards growth, we can trust Jesus to usher in that process in us through partnering with him. And so how have I changed? Gosh, yeah, I believe I've become a more loving person. I've also become more bold. I've had to be courageous. There were so many times, back to the thought of like, how did you know? So many times I didn't know, and I took a swing. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. Like standing in rooms I felt like I didn't belong in, talking about things that I had quickly Google searched just moments before but didn't really fully grasp, like just moments of courage. So that is a couple of things, a couple of areas where I feel like I have grown and transformed along this journey. And I think that's the beautiful invitation with Jesus. We're doing things for him. We're living in the world. We're serving. We're building. We're creating. Absolutely. That's all good stuff. But ultimately, he's committed to us and our transformation to become more like Jesus. And I'm so grateful for that, because I do have a tendency to want to do for Jesus. Like, let me do more stuff for you. Yes. And there are seasons where I felt the Lord just be like, Ashley, I don't want you to do anything. I just want you to be. I just want you to become. Yeah. And I've had to wrestle with that. But that's, I think, the beauty of our relationship with God.
That's so good. I love that you have these amazing dreams. Sometimes I don't even remember anything when I wake up. But so I always like pray. I'm like, God, just if you want to just talk to me, feel free. Ruthie, a lot of people, when they would encounter somebody who is homeless, someone who is a street worker, maybe they don't even have proximity to that. You came from the UK, now you're in San Francisco, and you feel this calling. How do you give yourself like the access? Because you're just kind of like, this is overwhelming. Like, this is such a huge problem. But it kind of goes back to what you were saying, like it's starting small. So how did Because Justice Matters like take that first step?
Yeah, such a great question. When I came out here, you're right, I came from a small village. I had grown up in a really safe, Christian, loving home. I didn't have any personal experience with most of the things that the women that I was seeking to serve have been struggling with. And yet, I also know what it's like to be human. I know what it's like to feel fear, to feel lonely, to feel shame, to long to be loved. Like I could relate in that place. And so when I moved to San Francisco and I would walk the streets, literally walking out at night, and, our ministry did this quite a lot. And I would often feel like, what do I have to offer? Like, I don't have a crazy testimony. I wasn't addicted. I haven't lived on the streets. I don't know what it's like to be in an abusive relationship. Like, what do I have to give? And I remember someone inviting me to connect with my humanity and say, hey, you don't have that crazy story, but you know what it's like to be human and to feel pain. Like, your empathy, your compassion can come from that place. You can listen, you can be present, you can love people. And so I think that's what started for me as an individual, as sitting on a street and asking someone, tell me about your life. Like, I'd love to hear about you. And I remember many times women sharing things and just weeping with them, just like, no one's ever cried over your life. Like, no one's ever mourned the things that you're telling me. I want to grieve that with you. It's worth grieving. It matters. It shouldn't have happened. You know, so it started there, loving people well. And then as I started Because Justice Matters, it was a very, very similar progression in some ways of like, hey, what's one small thing that we can do? Well, one of the first things we did is we set up a small table on the sidewalk in the heart of the inner city, and we invited women to come and get their nails painted. And that's all we did. Like, literally, come get your nails painted. We want you to feel beautiful and loved and seen. We want to create 15 minutes where you can sit down, and suddenly women would be coming and they would be crying. They would be falling asleep because they had no other safe place to be except with us. They would be telling us their story and saying, these were 40, 50-year-old women saying, I've never told a soul anyone this. And we're like, we just met you 5 minutes ago. Like, this was the space. It just started with one small thing. And again, the snowball effect. Like, God was like, oh, you're going to start here on the street, but one day you're going to have a building. You're going to serve hundreds. Like, it's going to become so much more. And yet it started with that small willingness to love people where they're at. So I think wherever we're at, wherever we live, you know, if maybe you don't have access to the same kind of demographic that I was working with, maybe you live in rural, wherever, you've got a neighbor, you've got, you know, your kids have got friends at school, you've got coworkers, you've got family members. How can you reach out and love and, you know, cultivate compassion and start small and never underestimate what can come from that? I mean, if I look back on so many things in my life that people might look at and say, well, wow, look at how that's blown up. And I was like, there was never a strategy for it to blow up. There was never a like, wow, this is going to become huge. It was simple obedience. It was love the person in front of me. And then God's like, I can do a ton with that. So yeah, start small.
Ruthie, you are highly gifted. I think, you know, God has continually used you since you were 16. You're executive coach, podcaster, writer, speaker, and founder. You had mentioned that Because Justice Matters, it's still going, but you had chosen to leave. Like, how do you know when it's time to go? Is there something that was stirring in your heart that God's calling you to something else? And how to just say goodbye to a certain chapter of your life?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I think, Danielle, there's many reasons to leave. And, you know, they look different for everyone. I can speak to mine in this situation. For me, I knew for a few years prior to leaving that I would be leaving. And it was a combination of a few things. Some of it was this growing sense that there was more. Again, this theme in my life, there's more. And realizing that I didn't see how it would fit with where I was currently at. There was a longing for certain things that didn't fit this puzzle. It was almost like I had a puzzle and then someone came over and gave me a piece and I was like, this doesn't fit here. And so I can either toss it away and say, I must be hearing wrong, or I can just hold it and just see what emerges. And over time, it was almost like more and more pieces came that I thought, oh, I have a desire to have influence in different areas. I have a desire to work with different people, like different areas of the city. Like, there were just things that were stirring in me. The same thing happened when I started preaching. It was like I never had a big desire to be a preacher. I didn't until there was an invitation and I thought, well, interesting. I wonder where this is going. So just holding things and observing them and getting curious about them. I think one of the other things for me that I saw in my organization is there were women within our team that were ready for their more, for their next level. And that wasn't going to happen unless I got out the way. And so not in a, like, people were asking for it or pushing me out or anything like that, but more I was almost like with prophetic eyes looking at them and seeing a year, 2, 3 down the road, you're going to be so much bigger than the role that you're currently in. And I want to make space for that. And so actually the woman that I handed over Because Justice Matters to, she's our executive director now, Gabby, you know, she started off with me 10 years prior as my assistant. And I said to her early on, I said, you are going to be way more than my assistant. She had such leadership. She had such vision. And over the course of those years, she eventually took on more and more and more. And then I saw her and I thought, she's ready to lead this thing. Like, it's time for me to step out of the way. way. And so there was a lot of that happened too. I was looking at the movement within myself and around myself and thinking, this is all pointing in the same direction, which is move along, make space, empower others, and trust that God has your future. And so that's kind of how I got to that decision. And of course, there was a lot of wise counsel, a lot of community input, a slow road, but that was it. And then I think on my departure of stepping out, it was really mattered to us that I did it well. And so I did it slow. I did it over the course of about 9 months. I poured myself into training and giving the team, and especially Gabby, everything that I possibly had. I remember right before I left, I said, I don't have another thing to share with you. I think I've given you it all. Now run with it, change it, innovate it, use it however you will. But I bless you. They blessed me. And it was just such a beautiful transition. Now, I know that's not everyone's story. I've spoken actually to a number of founders since I left who have sought me out and asked for wisdom. And it's not always that easy. It's not always that smooth. And there's a lot to navigate. But I think throughout it all, observing the internal movements of myself and what was happening around me and responding to that as I became aware of it.
Ruthie, you are a wealth of knowledge. And I love that you always go into a certain story for a question. Like, that is brilliant. I love how people communicate like that. And your coaching clients are they're so fortunate. Like, you have such good insight. Thank you so much for joining us today. I was thinking back in my mind about the question I asked you earlier, if you go in the future or the past. And after you told the story in Paris, like, how fun would it be just to be able, if you could just hop around, like to just stand next to yourself when you were, on Paris, and just to feel and be and just like whisper in her ear. That would be so cool. So Ruthie, thank you again, really, for sharing your insight. If people wanted to connect with you, how best can they do that?
Yeah, they can find me on Instagram at Ruthie Kim, and then they can go to my website, ruthiekim.com. There they're going to find sermons they can listen to. They can learn more about what it looks like to coach with me. They can hear about Golden, which is a ministry that I run serving women. So there's a lot on there, ruthiekim.com, and they can find me there.
All of Ruthie's information will be available in today's show notes. Ruthie Kim, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you, Danielle.
Ruthie had such great insight, and I just loved how each one of her stories was connected to this bigger picture and how God was working in her life. If you want to connect again with Ruthie, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Ruthie. Number 1, she talked about having this bent toward action rather than a paralyzing posture. So what is something you feel stirring inside you right now that you can take one step forward in action? Number 2, when we trust and believe, God is going to continue to expand our heart. So I'd love for you to spend some time in prayer to let that be an encouragement to trust Him and believe that He has so much more in store for you. This episode wouldn't be possible without my editor of a husband, Eric, who does a fantastic job on the production of the Parable Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode with Ruthie. We know you could be doing so many other things, but the fact that you joined in, we greatly appreciate it. Remember, your Parable showcases how God weaves through your life to continually expand who He knows you to be. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.